I'll never forget the night we decided to test the legend of the Screaming Tunnel. As I sit here writing this, my hands tremble, and my heart races at the thought of what we saw, what we unleashed. This isn't just a story to me. It's my nightmare, and it might soon be yours. The legend was well known on campus. They said if you walked through the old maintenance tunnel that cut beneath the library after midnight, you'd hear the scream of a girl who died there decades ago. Some said she was murdered. Others claimed she took her own life. Every version ended the same. Her ghost still haunted the tunnel, and anyone foolish enough to disturb her would face her wrath. I'd heard the stories before but brushed them off as dorm room gossip. Ghosts, curses, vengeful spirits. It was all just a way to spice up our otherwise mundane lives. Or so I thought. That night, my friends and I were hanging out in the dorm common room. It was the start of winter, and the chill outside made staying in with hot cocoa and bad movies seem like the perfect plan. But then, Ethan brought it up. You know, nobody's ever actually proved the Screaming Tunnel is real, he said, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. People talk, but where's the evidence? Because no one's stupid enough to go there after midnight, Dana replied, throwing a pillow at him. Or, Ethan countered, catching the pillow, they're just scared of nothing. Come on, we're adults. A ghost isn't going to hurt us. So you do it? I asked, half challenging him. He shrugged. Sure, but it's not fun alone. Why don't we all go? Let's settle this once and for all. I looked at Dana, who rolled her eyes but didn't outright refuse. Then there was Mark, the quiet one of our group, who just shrugged. I'll go if everyone else does. And just like that, we decided to face the Screaming Tunnel. At 11:45 p.m., we met outside the dorms, bundled in jackets and armed with our phones for flashlights. The campus was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes every sound, a rustling leaf, a distant footstep, feel amplified. I was starting to regret agreeing to this, but I couldn't back out now. The entrance to the tunnel was behind the library, a rusted metal door that hung slightly ajar. It had a no trespassing sign, but it was clear students had ignored it for years. The hinges creaked as Ethan pushed the door open, revealing a long, dark passage that smelled of damp concrete and decay. Ladies first, Ethan joked, but none of us laughed. We stepped inside, one by one, our footsteps echoing against the cold, narrow walls. The air felt heavier with each step, as if the tunnel itself were alive and watching us. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing instead on the faint light from my phone. Okay, Dana said after we'd walked about 50 feet. We're here. It's not midnight yet. Now what? We wait, Ethan said, checking his watch. 5 minutes to go. We stood in uneasy silence, our breaths visible in the cold air. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, disappearing into darkness. Behind us, the faint glow of the entrance seemed miles away. And then it happened. At exactly midnight, the temperature plummeted. My breath hitched as an icy chill ran down my spine. A faint, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears. A whisper, or maybe a sigh. Did you hear that? Dana asked, her voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the whisper grew louder, turning into a low, guttural moan. The air around us seemed to vibrate, and suddenly, a blood-curdling scream tore through the tunnel. It was the most horrifying sound I'd ever heard. Raw, anguished, and filled with a rage that made my skin crawl. We froze, too terrified to move, as the scream echoed around us, fading into an eerie silence. Let's go, Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. But before we could turn back, the lights on our phones flickered and went out. Panic set in as we fumbled in the pitch darkness. And then we saw her. At first, it was just a faint glow in the distance, but as it grew closer, the shape of a woman emerged. She was translucent, her face a twisted mask of pain and fury. Her eyes, if you could call them that, were empty voids that seemed to bore into my soul. Why? She whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. Why did you wake me? Ethan, always the skeptic, tried to speak, but his words came out as a strangled gasp. The ghost's gaze shifted to him, and suddenly he was screaming, clutching his head as if in agony. "Ethan!" Dana shouted, but he didn't respond. Instead, he dropped to his knees, his screams growing louder. Then, just as abruptly, he stopped. He looked up, his eyes wide with terror, and whispered, "She's in my head." That's when I felt it too, a cold, invasive presence crawling into my mind. Images flashed before me, my worst fears, my deepest regrets, all playing out like a twisted movie. I saw myself alone, abandoned and helpless. The pain was unbearable. "Run!" Mark yelled, snapping us out of our trance. We bolted toward the entrance, our feet pounding against the concrete. Behind us, the ghost's screams grew louder, echoing in my ears like a terrible symphony. We burst out of the tunnel, gasping for air. The night was eerily quiet again, as if nothing had happened, but we knew better. Ethan was the first to speak. "We shouldn't have gone in there," he said, his voice trembling. "We woke her up." None of us slept that night. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Dana swore she saw the ghost's reflection in her bathroom mirror. Mark began hearing whispers that no one else could hear. And Ethan? Well, Ethan was never the same. He'd sit in the corner of our common room, muttering to himself and staring at nothing. As for me, I'm still haunted by what I saw in that tunnel. I've tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that it was just a trick of the mind. But deep down, I know the truth. We didn't just test a legend that night. We unleashed something. And it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. So if you ever hear about the Screaming Tunnel, do yourself a favor. Stay away. Because some legends aren't just stories. They're warnings. It started with a sprained ankle. Danny, my best friend since we were kids, had always been a little reckless. That day, we were messing around on the soccer field after hours, kicking the ball back and forth, when he tripped over a sprinkler head and went down hard. I could hear the crack even from where I stood. "Damn it, Danny," I muttered, jogging over to help him up. His face was pale, twisted in pain. "It's nothing," he insisted, but I could see the swelling already. His ankle looked like a balloon ready to pop. "Come on, let's get you to the infirmary," I said. That's when he hesitated. He winced as I helped him to his feet, but didn't budge. "Do we have to?" he asked, half joking, half serious. "You've heard the stories." Everyone had heard the stories. The campus infirmary had this reputation. It was hard to explain, but people whispered about students who went in and never came out. Of course, those rumors always came with rational explanations. A transfer to another school, dropping out, moving back home, but it happened too often to be a coincidence. "Come on," I said, forcing a laugh. "You'll be fine. It's just a sprain." And Danny didn't look convinced, but he let me half carry him there anyway. The infirmary was a squat, windowless building on the far edge of campus. It always looked out of place, too industrial for the red brick charm of the rest of the university. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed faintly as we stepped in, the sterile smell of antiseptic hitting us like a wall. The nurse at the desk barely looked up. She was older, with sharp features and unnervingly cold eyes. "What happened?" she asked, her voice flat. I explained, and she just nodded, motioning for Danny to sit in a wheelchair. "We'll take care of him," she said. Danny shot me a look as they wheeled him away. "Stay close," he mouthed. I waited and waited. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, I went back to the desk. "Excuse me," I said. "My friend Danny, he came in with a sprained ankle. Is he okay?" The nurse frowned, her eyes narrowing. "Who?" My stomach sank. "Danny, he's..." I gestured vaguely. "Tall, dark hair, soccer jersey?" She shook her head. "There's no one by that name here," she said, her tone final. I argued, insisting I'd seen them take him. But she just stared at me, her expression unreadable, and repeated, "There's no record of a Danny here." Something was wrong. I knew it. I spent the rest of the evening trying to track him down. His dorm room was empty. His phone went straight to voicemail, and no one else had seen him. By morning, I was ready to call the police, but then I got a text. It was from Danny. "Hey, all good. Left campus for a bit. Don't worry about me." Except, it didn't sound like him. Danny hated texting. He'd always call instead, and the phrasing felt off, too formal, too distant. I tried calling back, but the line was dead. That's when I decided to go back to the infirmary. This time, I'd get answers. The next night, I slipped in through a side door. The place was eerily quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. I crept down the main hallway, past rows of closed doors, each with a small glass window. Most of the rooms were empty, sterile and untouched. But then I saw it. A room at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar. The light inside flickered faintly. I peeked through the gap. What I saw made my blood run cold. Danny was there, or at least it was someone who looked like him. He was strapped to a gurney, an IV in his arm. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, unblinking. There was something wrong with his skin. It looked too pale, almost waxy. Two figures in lab coats stood over him. One of them held a clipboard, murmuring something I couldn't hear. The other was holding a syringe filled with a strange, glowing liquid. My stomach churned. "We'll need the heart next," one of them said. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. My foot hit something, a stray mop bucket, and the noise echoed down the hall. The figures froze, their heads snapping toward the door. "Who's there?" one of them called out. I ran. The hallways twisted and turned, all identical. My footsteps echoed loud and frantic. I could hear them behind me, their shoes slapping against the tile floor. I ducked into a supply closet, holding my breath as they ran past. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then I noticed something else. A faint, rhythmic tapping, coming from inside the closet. I turned, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. At first I thought the closet was empty, but then I saw it, a vent in the corner, its cover slightly loose. The tapping was coming from inside. Carefully, I crouched down and pulled the cover away. What I saw will haunt me forever. It was a hand, a human hand, skeletal and bruised, reaching out weakly from the darkness. "Help me," a voice whispered. It was barely audible, but it was enough to make my blood freeze. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. The hand twitched, then went limp. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. That's when the door burst open. They grabbed me before I could react, dragging me back down the hall. I kicked and fought, but their grip was ironclad. They threw me into a room, slamming the door shut behind me. The room was small, windowless, with a single chair bolted to the floor. A bright light overhead made it hard to see. Then I heard a voice. "You shouldn't have come back." It was the nurse. She stood in the doorway, her cold eyes fixed on me. Behind her, one of the figures in a lab coat held a syringe, its contents glowing faintly in the harsh light. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped aside, revealing another figure. My stomach turned. It was Danny, or at least what was left of him. His skin was pale, almost translucent. His eyes were empty, soulless. He moved like a puppet, jerky and unnatural, as if controlled by invisible strings. "Say hello to your friend," the nurse said, her voice dripping with mockery. I screamed. I don't know how I escaped. The details are a blur. I remember shoving the nurse, running through the hallways, and bursting out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop running until I was back in my dorm room, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I tried to report what happened. But when I returned to the infirmary with campus security, it was empty. The rooms were spotless, the equipment gone. It was as if no one had ever been there. Danny's disappearance was written off as a transfer. His parents claimed he'd moved to another school, but I knew the truth. The text I'd received, the one claiming he was fine, had been deleted from my phone. To this day, I can't explain what happened. But every now and then I hear stories. Whispers about students who went to the infirmary and were never seen again. And every time I wonder how many of them became like Danny. When I first transferred to St. Marlow University, everyone told me how charming the campus bookstore was. A mix of old-world charm and modern convenience, they said. But no one ever mentioned the secret section, not until I stumbled into it myself. It started innocently enough. I'd been at the university for just a few weeks, struggling to adjust, when I decided to stop by the bookstore late one evening. I needed a distraction from the mounting pressures of assignments and social awkwardness. The store was mostly empty, except for a tired-looking cashier who barely glanced up from their phone as I entered. The warm smell of old paper and leather-bound books greeted me as I wandered between aisles. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting long shadows that flickered whenever someone walked past. It felt safe, comforting. But then I noticed something odd. A narrow doorway I'd never seen before was tucked between the philosophy and literature sections. The wood frame was weathered, the kind that looked like it belonged in an entirely different building. It didn't make sense. I'd been to this bookstore several times and knew the layout well, yet here it was, almost daring me to step through. Curiosity got the better of me. I glanced back at the cashier, but they were still engrossed in their phone. The air inside the doorway was cooler, tinged with the faint smell of damp stone. As I crossed the threshold, the noise of the store seemed to fade away. The room was small, more like a cramped reading nook, with shelves lined floor to ceiling with books that seemed ancient. Their spines were cracked, titles faded or written in languages I couldn't recognize. A single table and chair sat in the middle of the room, and on the table was a book, a plain leather-bound volume with no title. Something about it drew me in. My pulse quickened as I approached. My fingers trembled as I reached out and flipped it open. The pages were thick and yellowed, filled with what looked like handwritten text. As I read the first entry, my stomach turned. Tommy Harris will fall from the roof of the science building on October 2nd. It was today's date. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know a Tommy Harris, but the specificity of the prediction made my skin crawl. I turned the page. Emily Carter will lose her voice forever during tomorrow's choir performance. I knew Emily. She was in my history class, always humming as she walked to her seat. My hands shook as I flipped through more pages. Each entry was a name I vaguely recognized, accompanied by a chilling prediction. And then I saw it. My name. Ethan Wallace will uncover the bookstore's secret and lose more than he bargained for. My throat went dry. I slammed the book shut and backed away, nearly tripping over the chair. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to forget I'd ever seen this place. But as I turned to go, the doorway wasn't there anymore. In its place was a solid wall of bookshelves. I was trapped. Panic set in as I frantically pushed at the shelves, hoping they'd swing open, but they didn't budge. The room seemed to close in on me. The air felt heavier, colder. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, low and guttural, like it was coming from the walls themselves. "Read more," it urged. "Understand." My heart pounded as I turned back to the table. The book was still there, now open to a page I hadn't seen before. The handwriting seemed different, more frantic. Ethan Wallace, we'll make a choice tonight that will change everything. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I don't want this." But the whispers grew louder, insistent. "Read, take, give." Something compelled me to pick up the book again. My mind screamed at me to stop, but my hands betrayed me. I flipped through the pages, desperate to understand what this all meant. The whispers began to make sense, forming words in my mind. The book reveals truths, but truth demands payment. Suddenly, the predictions I'd read earlier came rushing back. Tommy Harris falling from the roof. Emily Carter losing her voice. Had I caused these events just by reading them? And what would I lose by continuing? The book seemed to answer my question. The words on the page shifted, rearranging themselves before my eyes. Knowledge for a price. Your fear. Your memories. Your soul. I dropped the book as if it had burned me. No, I didn't ask for this. The whispers turned into laughter, mocking, echoing, filling the room. The walls seemed to pulse, closing in. The doorway reappeared, but the exit was no longer empty. A shadowy figure stood there, featureless and menacing, blocking my escape. "You read," it said, though its mouth didn't move. "Now you owe." "Oh, what?" I choked out, backing away until my legs hit the table. The figure pointed to the book. Its pages fluttered wildly, stopping on a blank one. Words etched themselves onto the paper as if by an invisible hand. "A choice. Give your secret, or take another's." I didn't understand. "My secret? What secret?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, the book began showing me visions, moments from my life I'd tried to forget. The time I'd cheated on an exam in high school, the friend I'd betrayed, the lies I'd told to get ahead. Each memory cut deeper than the last until I was gasping for air. "Your secret," the figure repeated, "or take another's burden." I realized what it meant. If I gave up my secret, it would take a piece of me, leaving me hollow. But if I took another's, I'd be stealing their pain, their guilt, their suffering. Could I live with that? Tears streamed down my face as I stared at the book. The weight of the decision crushed me. I thought of Emily Carter, of Tommy Harris. Had someone else made this choice for them? With trembling hands, I reached for the pen that had appeared beside the book. The figure loomed closer, its presence suffocating. I closed my eyes and made my decision. When I opened them again, the room was empty. The book was gone. The doorway had returned to its original place. I stumbled out of the bookstore, the cashier's bored gaze following me as I fled into the night. But the weight of my choice stayed with me. Every time I see someone trip, fall, or suffer misfortune, I wonder, did I take their burden to save myself? Or did I leave mine for someone else to bear? The bookstore hasn't appeared to me since, but sometimes late at night I hear whispers, soft and distant, calling me back. And I know that one day I'll have to answer,